is my great pleasure to welcome at Tallinn University such a distinguished company of people who are engaged with Japanese philosophy, with the study of various Japanese thinkers, and we might as well say we have the crème de la crème assembled here, and start by introducing Jim Heisig, whose book on the Kyoto School is standard reading for everyone who is interested in the 20th century philosophy. Then Thomas Kasulis, whose Zen Action, Zen Person is probably the classic that everybody knows, but who is the author of many other books, including Intimacy and Integrity, which is a very interesting discussion of the subject. Then John Moraldo, who has been working in the same areas for many decades as well, and I think, John, your work is also mainly on Kyoto School, but you also treated the classics, Dogen and others. And finally Gereon Kopf, whose books relate Japanese philosophy to many European traditions, discussing phenomenology and existentialism and so on. I must say that when we read the work of all of you with the students in preparation for this meeting, then the students said, well, Gereon's work is the hardest to understand, so I don't know whether this is a sign of quality or possibly the students were just a little tired in the end. But let us start with this discussion with a question that well, some people say that that philosophy is a genuinely European pursuit. That philosophy was actually born in Greece and later integrated into itself some other traditions, Christianity notably, and then going through Renaissance and Enlightenment and so on, evolved into what it is today, and also that this same pursuit of philosophy or the same endeavor also spread to other countries. So we can speak about, let's say, Indian or Chinese or Japanese or Turkish philosophy, but only after European philosophy was exported to these places. Well, surely this is something we wouldn't agree with.
Actually, if we look at the word philosophy, there's no doubt that it's of Greek origin. It's a myth, however, to think that philosophy in content and method goes back only to the Greeks, and this myth was propagated around the time of Hegel, who rejected previous attempts to talk about Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy in a very positive sense. This has been pretty well documented now by a scholar, I think he's British but working in America, Robert Bernasconi. So it's somewhat of a misnomer to think that philosophy is of Greek origin. You have to specify more clearly what you mean by that kind of claim.
Well, I wouldn't make that claim. But,
well, I think furthermore, if we're going to look at first problematizing the Western idea of philosophy before we say whether it applies to another tradition, just to continue what John says, it was also at around that time of Hegel that philosophy enters the academy as a discipline. And to a great extent, what has happened in the last 200 years is that philosophy has developed into a kind of Wissenschaft in the university. And as such, it has very clear rules and methods that are non-negotiable, just as the Wissenschaft of physics has its rules, sociology has its rules, philosophy has its rules. But if you look at the history of what most of us think of as Western philosophy, they don't share that Wissenschaftliche kind of view. And so philosophy itself is a problematic term in the West. Before we start talking about Japanese philosophy, we ought to make that point clear to reinforce what John said.
So Socrates and Spinoza would not qualify as philosophers because neither of them had an academic degree.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And they had much broader interests. Look at all the function of myths in Plato,
Right.
or the function of rhetoric, the positive function of rhetoric in a lot of thinkers. Would there be any Hellenistic philosophy, Judaic philosophy, Christian philosophy?
Well, but if that
it's
is
only
so,
Greek,
But if that is so, how do we define philosophy? Because obviously there has to be something in common by which we assign a certain kind of mental activity to philosophy.
I think maybe another way of going at the question of why philosophy isn't simply a Western phenomenon is to look internally at the way philosophy has defined itself all the way through Hegel and up to the academy. And see, maybe there's something in there that forced philosophy to define itself as Western. And in particular, if we look at the idea of philosophy as universal, as going after arche in the sense of principles that transcend time and space and culture, once you've defined it that way, then the origins remain fixed at the first people to have that kind of idea. But if you look at universality as ideas that can be planted in other cultures, other traditions, as indeed it was around the Mediterranean basin, producing different results, then there's no reason to say that similar seeds can't come from other places in the world.
But is it justified to look for, let's say, universal rules of thought in the first place? You might say that, well, of course, there is a certain amount of various types of Western logic and so on, but does that necessarily apply to any kind of thinking that we still would consider, well, not rational in the sense of Enlightenment rationality, but rational in the sense of being intelligible and somehow organized?
Yeah, I think that's precisely the question, but it remains a question that should be investigated, and it's probably only philosophers who are going to, perhaps historians of ideas would investigate this. But I think part of even the Greek origin of philosophy is the self-examination, not only of the personal self, but of what we're doing, what this is, what our methods are. And so with that kind of tenor of investigation, self-investigation, we can ask if we find such a thing in other cultures and other geographical areas.
I think when we talk about definition of philosophy and looking at various traditions, I think there are a couple of issues at stake. As Tom pointed out, is what we are looking at philosophy right now is actually in a very limited context in the past 200-300 years, defined within the European tradition. So the first question is one of where within the historical context we place ourselves. The second question is also one actually of politics, is because of the way the history developed, though, especially in the 18th and 19th century global history. So the European paradigm did become the standard. It would be very interesting to ask if you take terminology from the Indian tradition or from the Chinese tradition, how that would apply to what happens in Europe. And if we then take John's definition of self-investigation, it's very interesting that, as Nishitani said, that's what's going on within the Buddhist tradition all the time anyway. So if we take that as definition, then obviously the more universal or more global existence or presence of philosophy is a given.
In fact, the question could be said, that it could be put this way, that for most of the history of philosophy anywhere in the world, the assumption has been that one of the things philosophy does is make people into better people. And that is really outside the domain of the Wissenschaft type of view of philosophy. It is profoundly non-humanistic in that sense. And Socrates would not recognize that. None of the medieval figures would recognize that. What is the purpose of philosophy? It's just accumulating knowledge. It wasn't called epistemiology. It was called the love of wisdom.
Yeah. So you can't be a philosopher from 9 to 5, so to say.
Right. Yeah.
And well, as I have had occasion to say earlier, a professional philosopher is a professional lover of wisdom, and we know what professional lovers are. So
it's a full-time job.
The other thing is, if you take critical self-reflection as definitive of philosophy, it may be that that's saying too little at the same time as it looks like it's saying too much. And that what constitutes critical self-reflection? Is it logical organization? Is it a function of grammar, as some people seem to think? Is it a function of orthopraxis, the consequences, as Tom was saying, the quality of life? What constitutes self-reflection? So maybe this question, which we've battered around among ourselves a long time, seems to me the most interesting way to go at it is something that Rein mentioned yesterday, and that is to start a project to write a history of world philosophy. And all these questions would come to light. I mean, what's critical self-reflection mean in Africa, in South America, in Europe, in Asia?
But the question that arises is not only one in terms of inclusion, not only in terms of geographic inclusion, but also in terms of genre. What's included is a poem, that self-reflective poem, and would that be part of that, what we would call philosophy, or do we add to that self-reflection some criteria of systematic account?
And there's probably many methods of critical self-reflection and self-investigation that we would discover if we look with an open mind. One of the towering figures of the Kyoto School, Nishitani Keiji, wrote a very interesting piece called The Standpoint of Zen, in which he talks about Zen as self-investigation, and he uses a stock phrase in Japanese from the Zen and the Buddhist tradition there. And he makes comparisons with Descartes' self-investigation, St. Augustine's Socratic self-investigation, but he also draws distinctions between Zen method of self-investigation and these of the so-called Western philosophers.
But that's actually something that characterizes non-Western philosophy, in the 20th century and now, is that non-Western philosophers are mostly very well read in Western philosophy or European philosophy. While Western philosophers normally don't have a clue about Japanese or Chinese or Indian philosophy, as if this doesn't exist. So what we would have to ask at some point is that whether these non-Western philosophies are bringing a contribution to philosophy as such, without which philosophy as such can no longer go on. And I think this is actually happening.
I think that the problem even goes more seriously than simply Western philosophy being the standard that even philosophers in the East have. And that the community of philosophers in the East is basically a community formed with the West. So that if it's true that Westerners are ignorant of Korean philosophy, for example, so are the Japanese. And so are the Chinese, by and large. Whereas in the West, we have so much translation of material that you can, without ever reading a page of William James in English, write a decent thesis about him in French or Italian or German. So that's not the case. There's little translation done of Korean philosophy in Japanese, for example. It's just beginning now, right? And you've had some experience with that, publishing translations into Chinese of Japanese philosophy.
To come back to your original question about whether there is such a thing as Japanese philosophy and the resistance on the part of Westerners to accept non-Western traditions as philosophical, it's not only the Westerners, the Western Academy, especially, say, the Anglo-American analytic philosophy. It's also, that resistance is also found, I think, among many Japanese who would see philosophy as such a kind of imposition on their own traditions, part of a cultural imperialism. And so they would see this whole endeavor that people like us are engaged in as somewhat Eurocentric.
Yes, so I've heard that too, that in China, for instance, some people say, well, yes, philosophy is definitely Western and we don't need it because it's useless and dead and whatever. So we have like different possible positions here. One would be the proto-Western position that philosophy is Western and Western only, and then we have people such as Nishitani or Radhakrishnan in India and so on saying, well, what we do also corresponds to what you understand as philosophy. And then there would be people perhaps like us who say that, well, yes, philosophy is not only Western, but perhaps also the definition or the order of philosophy should be broadened somewhat to include also some things which we hitherto didn't have. And then we have these rejectionists from other traditions who say, well, we're fine as we are.
There's another dimension to all this that we haven't really mentioned, and it goes back to something that John alluded to, the issue of rhetoric. And one of the things that's rather important to understand when we look at different traditions is that we can say that one of the role, philosophy isn't simply self-critical. It's not an internalizing, introspective, personal thing. It's also a social thing. And one of the things that philosophy does is develop rational ways of persuading people, right? Not ones that are not, not holding on arguments, but based in reason. But how that gets done can be quite different in different cultures, and so therefore unrecognizable. For example, if you're either an Indian and I'm an Indian, or you're a Western philosopher and I'm a Western philosopher, and we want to have a philosophical discussion, you try to pose your position as A, and I try to clear the position as not A. And then if I just show that you're wrong, then I am, by logic, correct. So my position is correct. However, we don't find that very often in East Asia generally, or in Japan particularly. More likely what would happen is I'll say, you're right, that's exactly right. But that's this little small part of the whole picture. Now let me give you the whole picture. So I eat up your position, but it looks like I'm agreeing with you. But actually what I'm doing, and what you would try to say, no, you have the small part, I have the big part, I have the big picture. And that's a very different form of argument. I know when my students read East Asian philosophy in translation, they often miss who is disagreeing with whom, because it looks like they're agreeing. They say, yes, he says that Mencius says that Schwinzer says that Mencius is right. Or he says he's right about this tiny little point, and the big point he's completely wrong about. And so there's this rhetorical structure of how persuasion, and this would make philosophical study relevant to intercultural relations and international relations as well. That is, if the way in which you persuade a person rationally takes on different structures, different rhetorical styles, we have to be very sensitive to that, just to be able to get along in the world, independently of the whole discipline of philosophy itself.
But that also means that that what we have to problematize is philosophy and its relation to truth, the notion of truth. Obviously now there will be very few people who think that absolute truth can be expressed in words, although this sentence has very many possible ways of interpretation, so you can think that there is an absolute truth, for instance, which can be understood intuitively, or then that there is an absolute truth which is how things are, but just we have to develop a more perfect language, with a Griffschrift or something, in order to so on and so on. But possibly the relation of philosophy and truth in all traditions is quite different.
Well, but I think it, when we talk about what qualifies as philosophy, coming back to your various positions, and which of the different persuasion strategies we then agree on calling philosophy, I think a lot of it has to do how we define it, and sometimes it sounds to me almost like a language game. And to give an example is when we talk about religion, and everyone who studied Japanese religion knows that if you ask the majority of Japanese are they religious, they will say no, and then they go off to the shrine and pray, right? So what it means then is that perhaps the person just said that he or she is not religious, is not religious, but has a different understanding of what religion is. And the same, I think, applies to how we define religion, or how we define philosophy, or what persuasion strategy we call philosophy.
I think to follow up on Tom's idea of rhetoric and Rein's question about truth, this is something Tom and I were discussing yesterday walking home. But the introduction of the distinction between literal and symbolic, or literal and analogical truth, which probably came sometime after Augustine. He was still doing a symbolic interpretation of the New Testament, and was associated with the church councils and so forth, and then found its way into philosophy in the West. Actually, I think it's older than that. But this idea is something that maybe isn't as widespread, and certainly not taken for granted in the East, where a literal interpretation of texts and a literal interpretation of so-called philosophical truths or propositions is probably considered pathological. In fact, I wonder if it wasn't part of the problem, didn't begin with Aristotle's treatment of the pre-Socratics. in which he takes Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes as literally explaining that the world came from water, or the world came from hot and cold and so forth, when it may be that their thinking was in line with the Greek myths themselves, more analogical and not literal at all. In any case, this distinction is so much a part of us, especially because science has become the norm for what constitutes truth, that we dismiss great areas of philosophy that didn't even have to develop a symbolic theory, because they intuitively knew that there were areas where literal truth simply was out of place.
So there might actually be some kind of alternative to a distinction between literal and analogical or metaphorical. And I've always been intrigued by the idea that in Buddhism there may be a notion of absolute truth which doesn't say that it is ineffable, that it's not expressible, and it doesn't say that we have to find one better and better way to express that truth, but rather which says that there are multiple ways. There is no one single way of expressing anything like an absolute truth. And there is no absolute truth without the particular forms of expression that might come through in language.
Moreover, every linguistic expression expresses one single small particle of the absolute truth.
I'm not sure that quite captures what I find going on in Buddhism either. It's somehow that absolute truth can be reflected, can be expressed in one linguistic manner, one linguistic expression, but it isn't going to be the only one. It isn't that it's necessarily partial. That's perhaps part of the logic too. It is part of what Tom was saying, in that the mode of philosophizing that we find common in East Asia is not one of rejecting other positions as false, but as incorporating them as partial. But at the same time, there is in at least some Buddhism, there is the idea that the absolute is reflected in multiple ways. It's kind of like the idea of Indra's net, where each intersection, each node of the net is a reflection of the whole.
It sort of ties in with Tom's example that the integrative approach, when says to someone who seemingly disagrees, you only get the small picture, but let me explain the bigger picture. Only now we don't have the bigger picture, it's just therefore multiple smaller pictures.
But the individual part still reflects the whole point. And that's what's different, because the atomistic thinking that has so dominated so much of particularly English language, but then ultimately much of European philosophy in the last 300 or 400 years, is the way you analyze is you break things down into the smallest parts, and then see how those parts are linked, and then you have how things are put together. And there's no idea that, the example I like to use is of DNA. I could take one cell from your body, but in there I can find the blueprint for your genetics for your whole body. So the part contains the whole as well as the whole contains the parts. And both of those are true. And if we believe that about DNA, then why is that not as important a model in philosophical thinking, and instead of this breaking down into little parts, the animistic parts, and then building out of that?
I think ultimately you do philosophy a disservice if you refuse the right to look for absolute truth, or even try to express absolute truth. Nobody wants to say that my vision of reality is partial. If you have a wall and there's a little chink in the wall through which you're looking, you know you can't see everything, but you want to talk about everything as far as you can see it. So we have a right to talk about and look for the absolute, and perhaps even change perspectives from time to time. As John was saying, the expression is a different thing, but to say, well, we're not going to look for absolutes or universals or the big picture, because ultimately we're not capable of talking about, or ultimately we're restricted to one perspective, I think that would eliminate great important contributions to the philosophical tradition, and would also blind us to a lot of stuff going on in the East, where there are different visions of the absolute.
Well, I would still be rather hesitant. I mean, of course we can talk about everything as long as we don't assume that we are, absolutely right about everything. But to look for universal, non-changing principles that would somehow form the backbone of something we call the absolute truth, well, that for me is a thoroughly Western endeavor, which doesn't really click with the Eastern traditions at all. And well, this actually brings us to the starting point of modern Japanese philosophy, because in the beginning, I think the Kyoto School philosophers, or Nishida and his disciples, wanted to do something that would be a follow-up of Western philosophy, and that would be related to the Western philosophical tradition, but then somehow they just had to integrate their own tradition into it. So a very strange situation appeared, in fact, where people were trying to philosophically express things for which the language or the system of thinking that they tried to use was not meant, or was not tuned to that, and in a way a lot of the struggles, the philosophical struggles of Japanese philosophy go on between two different languages co-inhabiting the same text.
That brings us to John's article on translation of philosophy, or philosophy as translation. And I think that's what makes the Kyoto School philosophy so exciting, is that you say there are different languages cohabiting the same text, and at the same time you also have a new language emerging out of that cohabitation of different terminologies.
But this has been the case of Japanese philosophy over all times, because also Japanese and Chinese coexisted in the text of Dogen, and then we can say that Sanskrit coexisted somehow, at least in Kukai, and the way that a lot of Japanese philosophy was actually born in translation. I have an article saying that a translation error from Sanskrit into Chinese produced the category of soku, which emerged as one of the main things in 20th century Japanese philosophy.
And one of the things is that the word error is kind of interesting, because it makes you assume when you say error that the person knew better but made a mistake, or that somebody does know better, and it might well be that the Sanskrit way of linking just didn't make sense to the Chinese in a certain way, and so they did something analogical, right, and it ended up being very different, and so therefore it no longer means the same thing at all.
I think the problem was actually in a kind of hierarchical or such an attitude that they thought that the Sanskrit text is extremely important, so every single word in it has to be translated into Chinese, because this is so important. We can't miss out everything. Although the Sanskrit authors would just like insert the particle eva at random just to point out the logical form of one sentence as opposed to the other. Yes, well, that was really strange. Yeah.
But in another sense, it isn't an error. I mean, it's a mistaken translation or a mistaken understanding of the original text. But if that kind of an intuition, even if it's mistaken, produces original thought, well, that's the way philosophy functions. And I mean, after you've got your insight, you may go back and put it in rational order or write it logically, but the intuition or the thoughts and so forth, they come by word association, by a bird that happens to fly by the window, they come by all sorts of different things. And so even errors, in a sense, I mean, Shinran's a good example of this.
Well, in that sense, we can say that all philosophy is actually a chain of superb errors in interpretation of previous texts.
Well, there are fruitful errors and not fruitful errors, right? And some errors just bear wonderful fruit, so that they then become something that other people will then make errors about again, and so forth.
Even to the extent of, in Dogen's case, what we could call almost deliberate misreadings of classical texts in order to create something new.
No, I'm glad that you said all philosophy is like that. So it's not necessarily distinctive of Japanese philosophy. I think it's good to look for features that might be distinctive of a tradition like Japan's. But it might be the case that every philosophy, or the philosophies of all traditions and cultures, have had the same kinds of issues in encountering other traditions. You know, that Greek is, there's an expression that you well know in English, that's Greek to me, totally foreign, totally foreign. And the Latin translations of Greek terms were quite radical and revolutionary. One thinks of an example today of Heidegger's notion of aletheia as disclosure, which is a kind of mistake, according to the Greek scholars, but which has opened up a whole new vista of way of understanding truth as disclosure before it's truth as correspondence with reality.
I think in the case of Aristotle's translations into Latin, that Aquinas was so frustrated with the Islamic translations that he got his own translator and therefore came out with a new interpretation of Aristotle. Even though he couldn't read Greek himself. So.
Well, I think one of the things that has come out of this discussion, and those of us who have been working on Japanese philosophy and dealing with this issue of is it really philosophy, have found is that when you try to say whether Japanese philosophy is philosophy, it turns into a discussion of what is philosophy. And I see things in the Western tradition I never saw before if I hadn't studied Japanese philosophy. I realize what we as Western philosophers have been doing and what are the positive aspects of that and what are the negative aspects of that, the blinders aspect and the opening up aspect of that. And so it actually makes me think more philosophically about philosophy because I study a tradition other than the Western tradition. And I think that sort of always happens in these discussions, is that we start out talking about Japanese philosophy, but very quickly starts becoming a discussion, well, what is philosophy and how does philosophy progress?
This is just like, I think Wittgenstein has said that if you only know one language, then you can't understand it. That you have to study a foreign language in order to know your own. Well, you have to study a foreign tradition in order to understand your own, to take it apart.
Now you raised another question though, which is not just what is philosophy, is there such a thing as Japanese philosophy, but supposing there is Japanese philosophy, what does it have to contribute? Why should one study it? And this is a question that I am challenged always to try to answer. I'd like to hear what the other people say about it.
I think, Tom, you had a very good definition of the contribution of Japanese philosophy of like two kinds of knowing. And I always like to point out, to overcome the sort of Orientalist otherness aspect of this, that in discussing what I consider to be a theme, a riff in Japanese philosophy going back to Kukai, in introducing that, I like to instead quote from Henri Bergson in the Introduction to Metaphysics, where he says in the beginning there are two kinds of knowing. One is walking around and analyzing something, and the other way of knowing is to become it, right? And Kukai, in effect, has that same distinction as you look at how it does, and it's a distinction of what he calls the exoteric, Kengyo, versus the esoteric, Mikyo. And from that point on, Japanese philosophy has assumed this the second kind, becoming the object, engaging it. So part of what it is you, and you are part of it, so you understand it. The way we can look at this is, who better knows what clay is? A geologist or a potter? Who better knows what color is? A physicist or a painter? And we ultimately have to say, well, they both know, but it's a very different kind of knowing. Then we ask, which is the real kind of knowing? And I think in the Western tradition in the last few hundred years, it's been the geologist really knows the clay, the physicist really knows the color. Whereas in the Japanese tradition, it has usually been the opposite. It's the potter who knows the clay, the painter who knows the color. But this brings us back to language, because the geologist and the physicist, they can describe the object of their knowledge in a sort of understandable and fairly unambiguous language, while the painter and the potter, they have an intimate contact. They have they have a very direct experience of their object of knowledge, but they wouldn't possibly be or necessarily be able to speak about it with anything else than their pottery and paintings.
Well, that's right, but then I mean, they show that they know it. If I am, in most of our life, actually, the kind of knowledge that counts is the ones that can be shown. If I'm taking a taxi and the driver doesn't show immediately that he or she knows how to drive, I'm in great distress. Now, it may be that this person read a manual and I can tell you all about it, but unless the person can show the knowledge. And so what I'm trying to say is that actually, if you want to define philosophy as, or knowledge as that which can be so objective that the who is saying it is irrelevant, that's fine. But let's also note that that's a very small part of what we mean by knowledge in our ordinary life and what we bet our lives on.
Yes, I mean, I'm just trying to provoke you, but if we say that, well, Japanese philosophy is in pursuit of such knowledge which cannot be expressed objectively, understandably, and so on, then perhaps it should call itself something else, art or...
Now, wait a minute. Why shouldn't we consider a pot that the potter makes of clay, or a painting that the painter uses color for as an expression of...
well, try to publish a pot in the Journal of Philosophy.
Well, there's different manners of expression. You can't publish a pot. You can talk about it. You can publish pictures of the pot.
Heidegger writes poetry,
yes.
right? So there's a point of philosophy that you have to be poetic to express it.
I think this is a dangerous path, really.
See, this comes back to the issue of truth and the search for absolute truth. What Tom was saying about the predominant trend of Western philosophy to consider reality in our pursuit of the truth of that reality as something objective and divorced from us, somehow not affected by the human perspective, today I think is being challenged by the ecological crisis, for example. So that not necessarily East Asian perspectives exclusively, but the perspective that shows that human beings are engaged in transforming the world, and we have to come to understand our own actions and our own forms of consciousness if we want to arrive at the truth of nature and a so-called objective world, I think is really coming to the fore.
Yes, but that's something that Western philosophy would also say that, well, we are doing this already. But, I think the sort of permanent being on the margin of several languages, which characterizes the Japanese philosophical tradition from the beginning to this day, has actually created a space where it has been remarkably successful in inventing a language to describe the kind of knowledge that you were talking about. Something that, well, a Japanese potter or a Western potter, they are on equal terms with clay, but the Japanese philosopher has a different attitude to the language slash reality problem than a Western philosopher has, and that's what makes Japanese philosophy important.
And I think that's important too, that it is rare for, say, a contemporary Japanese philosopher to not allude at some point to gardens, ikebana, pottery, and so forth, where the Western philosopher feels that, no, I can only refer to science or
Q and P.
Right, Q and P, logic, abstract.
Partially, but with a qualification, I think. If we want to ask what Japanese philosophy's contribution, something that you wouldn't find from studying Western philosophy, you could look at which Western philosophies Japanese were attracted to, not as a branch of study, but as a way to reflect from their own tradition. For example, Kant, the Kantian philosophers, almost never do anything with Japanese thought, Japanese art, Japanese knowing by becoming, this kind of thing. Whereas the existentialists and the Heidegger and the Hegel scholars have always related it to religion and so forth. So what's unique in a way is reflected in the kind of Western thought that prompts them to integrate it and to respond from a Japanese point of view. And not all philosophies do that. I mean, I think one of the big problems with Nishida's central period of struggling with the Neo-Kantians was that he couldn't, his categories, his Eastern way of thinking just didn't lead him anywhere. He wasn't making a contribution. He wasn't finding anything at home. But as soon as he shifted, and got out of the Neo-Kantian period and shifted to vitalism and that kind of thing, he opened up.
But I think there's also another take. We're going back to Tom's two attitudes, and since you mentioned Nishida is in one of his lectures, actually, he talks about three attitudes towards life, and he uses the example of watching a play, and sort of the objective, what we call the so-called Western approach, would be to be the audience, where you're sort of removed from the action, and you can analyze it, you can look at the stage and all that. But then there are the performers who are in action, right? And so on the first side, it seems like you have two completely opposite approaches. The objectivist approach, which is removed and looking from the outside in, and then you have the so-called subjectivist approach, which is in action. But Nishida then goes one step further and says actually both of them are abstractions, right? You may tend to be more objective, or you tend to be more subjective, but ultimately we can't be exclusively one or the other. Even the most objective person writing about life or writing about time still has the experience of being inside, right? And even the most involved, subjective, engaged person still has to at one point stop and to think before he or she can talk about it. So those two positions are actually abstractions, and then when we do philosophy, we both move into the middle.
Yes, so I think we have established that without Japanese philosophy, or without some knowledge of Japanese philosophy, current Western philosophical reasoning is also, how to put it politely, depriving itself from something very useful. And if we don't find Japanese philosophy or Chinese and Indian philosophy for that matter in curricula and research agendas of Western philosophical departments, that means that the reasons are elsewhere. I think they're just institutional. That there should be new positions created, new manuals printed, and so on. But sooner or later, possibly this revolution or change in how we see philosophical reasoning is going to occur.
Let me ask you, as the rector of a university here in Estonia, you're on the border, as it were, of Eastern Europe and wide Eurasia and so forth. Do you think it's more likely for philosophy to open up to the philosophies of the Eastern Japanese philosophy in a situation like Estonia than it would be in Paris or London or Chicago?
Well, for us it would be the natural thing to do, but I hope that Paris, London and Chicago are also opening up at some point.